QSO Today, episode 314, Dr. Scott Wright K0MD. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. This is the first QSO Today since the first QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo last weekend on August 8th and 9th, 2020. The date reference is for those who may listen to this podcast years in the future. Who can know? Frankly, I am brain dead from this whole project, and I'm in recovery while I'm trying to work with the team to get the surveys, exhibitor reports, leaderboard issues, etc., resolved. The leaderboard was the bane of my existence last weekend. The purpose was to encourage engagement with the exhibitors who paid for the event through their exhibitor booth purchases. We had a couple of people, the first not a ham, really game the system. We learned how they did it and made some adjustments. I think that in spite of the criticism, especially from those who would not have been happy with any kind of game, that the leaderboard fulfilled its purpose. I got a great email from a young teen who said that she was gaming the system by going to every booth and watching the videos for a minute or two, downloading all of the content from the exhibitors, watching the beginnings of all the webinars, until she found one that interested her. Then another. And by the end of the weekend, she decided that she was interested in 3D printing antennas and had a role model, a mentor, an Elmer that she could relate to, and a corner of the hobby that she wanted to pursue. For me, as the person who created this event, if the kids game the system to find their place, then the nasty messages that I fielded all weekend were worth it. I will do the leaderboard again and tighten the rules, but to do it again I will. All in all, the event was very positive, and it was a trendsetter, and I discovered that I could, after all these years, put together a great team and pull it off. I appreciate all of you who came, are still coming to the Expo as it is on demand or in playback mode. Your positive comments and good wishes to me and the team are greatly appreciated. Like any activity, you get out of any endeavor what you put into it. We had a great time. Now we need some rest before we start on the next one. Dr. Scott Wright K0MD was my guest on this podcast in October of 2016 in episode 116, almost 200 episodes ago. I asked Scott to be the keynote speaker last weekend, and he really delivered. Even as busy as he is during this COVID-19 pandemic, he was willing to prepare and share with all of us in his keynote address. It is still available in the Expo Auditorium, Track 1, if you didn't get to see it. I thought it appropriate that if you heard the keynote but didn't know Scott, that now would be a good time to let Scott tell his own ham radio story again. K0MD, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Scott?
4Z1UG, K0MD. Hi, Eric. It's Scott. How are you?
I'm great, Scott. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. I became a ham radio operator around age 13. I was technically licensed 3 days before my 13th birthday. So I started at age 12, maybe even before then. Like many of the previous guests on your show, I can say that I had a fascination with electronics as a youngster. I had some old television sets that were, of course, tube type and with the big cathode ray vacuum tubes or screens, and I would take them apart and try to figure out what the parts and components meant. Unlike Gerald, the Flex Radio, I didn't categorize them and catalog them and organize them. I wasn't quite that much of an engineer type, but I was fascinated with electronics, and one of my friends in my childhood, his father repaired televisions, so I enjoyed watching him do that. But in 7th grade, I found a book in the library. I wish I could remember the title, probably the same book that many of your guests have talked about. But it talked about how to get started in ham radio. It wasn't an ARRL book, but it was by someone else. So I took it home and started learning Morse code by sight, not by sound, because it had the Morse code organized by dots and dashes. And I found after 2 or 3 nights of study, I could recite a character and knew the entire Morse code alphabet, which quite surprised me. So probably Thursday of that week, I mentioned to my dad that I was interested in learning more about ham radio, and had he ever heard of it, or did he know anyone involved? And he said, of course, we have some neighbors who do ham radio. And one day the next week, I found myself at the home of Jim Burgess, WA4OJT. Jim was a local pharmacist in his 30s who had gotten his radio license and had what I thought was a dream station. He had a tower and a Yagi, and he had two complete radio lines. He had a Kenwood 599 twin line that looked like the cat's meow, the most modern-looking, sophisticated radio I'd ever seen, and an Atlas 215. And Jim had his DX station going. We were listening to stations in Europe and other places, and I watched him work a few stations. And I said, how do I get a license? And he said, well, I have another gentleman in town I want to refer you to, Bill Alcorn, WB4GSG. And it turned out that Jim and Bill both attended the church that my family and I attended. So Bill gave me some study material from the league, and a few weeks later I took the novice exam. That may have been in February of 1977. And I did fine on the code. And on the theory, he said, I think you've passed, but you missed a few questions. Let's see what the FCC thinks. And on May 13th, 1977, I was issued the call sign WD4HAD, Whiskey Delta 4, Hotel Alpha Delta. And my friend Jim said, well, they had to give you a call, didn't they? With a tongue-in-cheek. And so Bill Alcorn loaned me an HW16, a crystal-controlled radio. And Jim Burgess helped me build a two-band dipole. We took 450 ladder line and cut one side for 80 meters and one side for 40 meters, I believe. And I was able to get on the novice bands and operate CW on 80, 40, and I think 15. And it was tough at first because with the crystal-controlled radios, you would call on one frequency and listen around. But finally, after several days or maybe a week, I had my first QSO with a West Virginia ham. And he was a patient retired man because he QSO'd with me for 45 minutes. And probably at 5 to 7 words a minute, that was more painful than I can recall. And I got a nice QSL card from him with a nice letter. And a few weeks later, my dad decided that maybe he should buy a radio for me. So he and Mr. Alcorn picked out a radio. I wanted to get a Kenwood 520 because that's what Jim Burgess recommended, and also another person in the community who was a newly licensed ham had gotten. But my dad decided that I should have a Heathkit, so he bought a used HW101, and it had a VFO, and I used that radio every day. And within a year, I had upgraded to general class, and soon after that to advanced class, and began working at odd jobs, mowing yards and doing things to earn money so that I could improve my ham station. And there were 2 meters was just coming around at the time, and I remember having a tough decision. I would go to the pharmacy where Jim worked, and I met another pharmacist, John Sandage, WA4ZKA, and I would go to the pharmacy and talk with him and say, I can't decide what I want to spend my $200 or $300 on. Should I buy the new Heathkit 2-meter radio, or should I get an antenna? And eventually they both said to me, listen, don't waste your time on 2 meters. We'll help you put up a Yagi if you buy a tower. So eventually I had made enough money, and I went to the appliance store in town, which was owned by no one other than Bill Alcorn, the guy who was my first Elmer, and bought a 40-foot tower. And then I had enough cash left over to buy an Alliance HD 73 rotor, which a number of your guests have talked about, and a Wilson System 33 tri-bander. And Jim Burgess came and put that up, and I remember guying that tower with rope. And today, of course, with the antenna installation that I have guyed with Philly strand, I look back and wonder how the first tower ever survived. But I got on and soon was on sideband and CW working the world, and just had a fabulous time. And then that set the hook pretty deeply, and I kept working as a teenager through high school and soon had enough money to buy a used Drake B-line. And wow, I thought I had just won the lottery because I'd upgraded to a B-line with a transmitter and receiver, and I could set them together and work split. And I was on the air a lot. I remember my mother saying to someone when I went to high school, she said, "Well, we know Scott will study, but he does make time for his hobby every night." And I think that's true because I was on the air. I didn't really apply for awards in those days, but I collected QSL cards. I lived in a very rare county, and county hunting was getting popular. And I remember people calling me on the air and asking for a QSL card, and they would come and I would send them. It turns out that I worked a very famous DXer in those days, ON4UN, and had no idea that I would host him at a meeting many years later at the W0DXCC as a speaker. And John said, "Thanks from McCreary County, Kentucky. I need it." Later in my high school time, a skilled DXer moved into the community, Peter Craw, K2 Uniform Papa Delta. Mr. Craw was a business executive with a local manufacturing company, and he had a great HF station. His wife was my high school Spanish teacher. I went over to his home, and he showed me his radio setup, and he came to my house and showed me how to work CWDX with my beeline, how to work split, and how to actually call and work DX. And he taught me a lot in the limited time we had together. Probably the most memorable QSO I had as a teenager, Eric, was one day I was on 15 meters phone, and I got a call, or did call, Victor Papa 6 Tango Charlie, Tom Christian, in the Pitcairn Island. And I didn't know Tom's last name initially. And I said, I was on the air and I said, "Tom, it's a pleasure to work you on the Pitcairn Island. Where is the Pitcairn Island?" And at that very moment, my dad had walked through my bedroom, and he stopped and he sat down and he listened and he said, "Scott, would you ask Tom if his last name was Christian?" So I did, and Tom said yes. And then my dad said, "I have another question. Would you ask him if he is related to Fletcher Christian?" And I said, "Sure." And so I did, and Tom said, "Yes, that's my grandfather," and so on. And then after we finished the QSO, my dad sat down and he said, "You've just worked an incredibly famous person." And he told me the story about Mutiny on the Bounty and about how Tom's grandfather had settled on the Pitcairn Islands. And I said to my dad, "I didn't know you had an interest so much in this." He said, "Oh, yeah, I've always wanted to be a ham operator, but I could never learn Morse code. And I'm impressed that you have." And I said, "Oh, well, I wish that you should study. It's not that hard." And after the no-code licenses became available, my dad was sufficiently up in age that he was unwilling or uninterested, I guess, at that time in getting his license. But he would have had no trouble with Morse code. He was a very smart guy. And I have to say, in college, the radio bug stayed because when I went to the University of Kentucky as an undergrad, Eric, I found the ham station and would go over and work the ham station and practice my foreign language skills by working Europeans who would speak the language I was studying in college. That's the story of how I got started in ham radio.
Did ham radio and electronics play a part in the choices that you made for your career?
That's a great question, and it really did. I applied to one engineering school out of high school, Rose Holman, largely because a friend in high school had done the same, and I thought I might want to major in electrical engineering. But it turned out that a couple of things happened. One, Terre Haute, Indiana was a long way from McCreary County, Kentucky, and as a young kid out of Appalachia, I just thought it was probably too far for me to make the journey. And I was elected state president of a youth organization, and that really sealed the deal that I had to go to an in-state university because I was expected to do a lot of leadership activities my freshman year in college. And in hindsight, when I look back, I often think today that having studied electrical engineering would have really helped me with ham radio, but what I enjoyed most about ham radio as a teenager and even today is less the electronics and really more how I can meet people from around the world, the geopolitical connections that you can make. I've met so many interesting people on the air. I met an economist once who was from Brussels who worked at the EU Central Office, and we talked about monetary policy. Not that I'm an economist, but I'm a curious learner. And I have gotten to know ham operators from all around the world, and that's the thing I enjoy the most. Once I was doing a contest in Chile, and a station from Uruguay called me, and from Montevideo, and I said to him, "I'm going to be coming over later this week to speak at a conference." So he said, "Stop by my home." So I did on the way in from the airport, and we struck up a friendship that went on. So what I want to say about ham radio is what it did is it gave me a curiosity for the world and an interest to meet people from around the world, which really has served me well as a physician. I'm an academic physician at the Mayo Clinic, and I'm invited a lot to speak, and it really gives me the confidence and the desire to go around the world to speak. I think the other thing that ham radio has done or did is it taught me how to discipline myself, to study, and to pursue tough and hard goals. And that was very helpful for college. And I have to say, when I was training in cardiology, I found a lot of parallels between understanding RF issues and understanding circulatory physiology. And if I hadn't been an extra class ham, I probably would not have understood the circulatory system as well as I do now. So in many respects, ham radio was quite helpful, even if it was more of a circuitous route rather than a direct route through electrical engineering. I have to say today, what I enjoy most about it is that I have a pretty, at times, demanding and stressful job, and ham radio is a wonderful outlet for relaxation and reducing stress and keeping me focused on what's important in life so that I can get back to doing the day job less distracted by how tired, fatigued, or just worn out that I might be if I didn't have a hobby that energized and recharged me.
I saw on your website, you make a mention of it, that there's a heat map called the RBN activity of K0MD. Can you explain what that is and where it gets the information that it displays?
Certainly. The RBN is an abbreviation for Reverse Beacon Network. I don't recall who started the Reverse Beacon Network, but one of your previous guests had alluded to it on a show. It's a series of ham stations around the world who have a receiver and a small antenna, like a vertical or a shortened vertical stick or a wire, who just have coupled with that a software-defined radio so that they can capture the ham bands. And then they have receivers that decode your RTTY or Morse code signals, and they post when you're operating. So today, before our interview, I spent some time on 15 meters to check propagation for the upcoming RTTY contest. And I worked into the Middle East, and I worked into Europe. And I was calling CQ largely to see how well the receiving stations in Europe and in America were hearing my signal on 15. So this is a type of receiving network that will tell you how strong your signal is in any part of the world. So if I point my antennas to Europe, I can see stations in Germany and in England and in Wales and Spain, France, and all the EU countries, Norway, of course, and Belgium, showing me my actual signal strength based on an SDR receiver. And it tells me whether the propagation is sufficient to make a QSO there or not. So a signal unit of, for example, 3 or 4 means that you might be S2 or 3 on the S meter, so it's going to be marginal propagation. Many times I'm 15 to 20, and so I know that I'm very loud and I should have a nice pileup if I can call CQ and have people answer me in that particular area. I remember after I put in my third Yagi from my Yagi stack for 10 through 20, I was 48 something on a receiving station in Quebec, and I was quite worried I had damaged the receiver's front end with a signal that loud because it was showing me I had just tremendous gain with one hop propagation off 20 meters. So it's a way to mark when you're on the air. And the link I have on my webpage was sent to me by K4IU because he thought it would be nice for me to look and profile how much I've been on the air the last year, and he has done it for his station, and any station can do it. And it shows you how much you've been on the air and where you've been received on 80 meters through 10 meters. And it shows you really in what regions of the world you've received. So big contest stations will have big footprints, and casual operators will have a few hits. And so you can get a sense for how busy an operator is and how effective the station is at being received in various parts of the world.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion, as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers, in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for SOTA activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. So you're 4 hours behind UTC, right? 4 or 5 hours?
Right.
If I'm looking at this heat map, it looks like you operate all day long, but we're looking at, a composite of the year in terms of the hours that you operate?
That's correct. You're looking at, I think they show it by days at this point, and what days and parts of the month you're on. So it does look like I operate all day long, but I don't. My operating is largely from, say, 23:30 to 04:30 GMT, except on days that I'm off, and then I'll be on from 13 or 1400 GMT through maybe even 2400 periodically. I don't stay on the air all the time. I have other interests besides ham radio. I know it's hard to believe, and my family would question that, but it is a hobby, not a way of life to me at this point.
How does amateur radio impact your family life?
Well, I don't think there's any completely perfect way to say that the hobby positively or negatively impacts your family. I think life is about either being too intense or too passive. It's a bit like alternating current instead of direct currents. You're either over or undershooting. So there have been times that I've put too much time into the hobby, and lots of times that I should have paid more attention to the hobby to work Rare DX. But during those times, I have to say the children were much younger, and I was being much more productive academically, publishing papers. So I chose, I think, more important priorities at that point. I'm at a stage in life now where 3 of the children are in college or graduate school, and only 1 is still at home. My wife has always been supportive of ham radio. I remember when we were dating, I took her over to the University of Kentucky station and showed her how I could talk to people in Europe. I didn't spend much time on the air in those days, but I did a little bit. But she and the children have been very generous to me. 3 of our daughters got their ham licenses several years ago. Largely, the first daughter, the youngest, got licensed, and then the other 2 who were older thought, well, if she can, we can. So they all did. And then I thought, wait a minute, I want to get them upgraded. So I said, I'll tell you what, girls, if any of you will upgrade to general class, I'll take you to Easter Island to operate. And I thought that would be really exciting and quite an incentive, and it's not happened yet. My daughters, like their father and mother, have spent more time in academic pursuit than in hobby pursuit, thankfully. They're very serious and good students. And so one of them, the youngest one, Sarah, W0 Sierra Mike Whiskey, has contested with me a little bit. The other 2 have just been inactive. And my son, who's soon to be 14, has a lot of interest in electronics, but he's a gamer. And his best friend wants to learn Morse code. And so I'm hoping that my son and his best friend will learn code together, and if there's an interest, maybe get their ham license. But like anyone who's been active in the hobby, I think you feel at times you overshoot, and at times my family has said that the antenna building has been stressful, that I've put a lot of attention into it, and they wondered if I was putting too much attention, and I think that's a fair criticism. And what I've tried to do now, and to balance things, is to carve out a few weekends a year that I do intense contesting, usually CQ Worldwide and the ARRL DX contests. And then the rest of the time I'll do casual operating, because I don't want to spend too much time away from my wife and children on that. So it's like any ham. I think they've seen me quite happy and elated with working a new DX entity, and also quite stressed and frustrated when something breaks or a computer interface doesn't work properly. And I think at one point my wife said, "Wouldn't it have been easier to just buy a boat? You could have had more fun." and I've thought that, I've thought the same thing. But the hobby is I've done it nearly 40 years, and it's been a lot of fun. And I hope it's something that I can continue to do as I get older.
Your QRZ page shows a very impressive SO2R, and for the listeners, that's a single operator 2 radio contest setup. And of course, you have a very impressive antenna farm. Can we start at the beginning? What attracted you to contesting?
That's a great question. I am a late comer to contesting. If there's anything in ham radio that I regret not doing longer, it's contesting. So I started ham radio in the late 70s and did mainly DXing because I wanted to work people in other countries. And the hams in my community were DXers. I went to field day in the late 70s with the local radio club, and I usually stayed all night. And the thing I loved most about field day was high rate operating, was working one station after another and trying to work as many an hour as I could. And I never really knew much about contesting, and I got quite distracted, appropriately so, with my education and early career time. And in late 2006, my neighbor and friend, K4IU, suggested that I should take up contesting. He said, "You're a competitive guy. I think you'd like contesting." So I got on the CQ Worldwide contest. I'd been in contests before, but just to work DX. I didn't really try to score a lot of points and be competitive. But I got on and I did that contest, and I operated 30 plus up to 48 hours. And when you start contesting, it becomes a bit addictive, and if you're a competitive person. And then the next May 2007, I was invited to speak in China. And I said to Fred, I said, "I really would like to do the CQ Worldwide WPX in China." And I said, "I know there's a radio club in Beijing." So I asked the nation of China to issue me a radio license, and they did. And the Beijing club hosted me. Fan Ben, BA1RB, was kind enough to host me. And I have tried to contest nearly every major contest since, because I find it a fun way to really push myself, to set new goals, and to achieve some of the DX goals that I wanted. I would never have gotten DXCC had it not been for contesting. I would never have gotten 5 and now 7-band DXCC had it not been for the disciplines of contesting. And I certainly would never have built the antenna and radio station that I have had it not been for contesting. And I owe a lot to my friends who taught me the basics of contesting, K4IU, W0GJ, and several others, and now to K9CT and a few others who have challenged me to try to build a bigger and better contest station that is appropriate for the size of lot that I have and for what I want to do in the hobby. I'll never be a multi contest station, but I do like to do multi-single contesting with friends, and I like to try SO2R. I'm just a beginner at SO2R. But I hope someday to be like your former guest N9RV and many others, and K5ZD and K1DG, who do it all the time in every contest.
You have the equipment to actually do SO2R, but what do you think it's going to take to be good at it?
I think it's practice. I found that CW contesting is all about practice. Sideband contesting is all about practice, and your skills grow quickly. I think with SO2R, my strategy is to start with small, shorter contests and then to build it up. I can do phone SO2R very easily. CW SO2R is more of a challenge, but I think it's a bit like I think it's a challenge for the brain that's healthy, because we know that as we get older, if we work crossword puzzles and do other brain-challenging activities, we're less likely to have dementia or to have memory loss. And I think the same is true for me with SO2R. It's one of those challenges to require my brain to grow some new circuits, to expand, and that's one of the reasons I want to learn to do it.
Another good reason for amateur radio, of course.
I agree.
How often do you travel abroad to operate, and where do you like to go?
I travel abroad 6 to 12 times a year for work. In fact, I've been to Europe 3 times in the last 5 weeks before we've done this interview. Either going to meetings, consulting, or speaking at conferences. I try to operate 2 times a year abroad. My favorite place to operate abroad, contest-wise, is the Turks and Caicos Islands. I have been able to rent an antenna farm there at the VP5 JM's home, Jody Millspa, and we bring equipment. But I like to operate in the Turks and Caicos for contesting. I also have operated in Chile as Charlie Echo 2. And I try to operate every August and every December in Chile when I'm there at meetings. And if it overlaps with CQ Worldwide, I will do that contest from Chile. A couple of years ago, I did a day of CQ Worldwide from America and the second day from Chile, and I turned in 2 scores. Now, neither score was spectacular, but for me it was a personal goal to say that I did it, and I was separated only by the 14 hours or so of travel time between my home and the hotel in Chile. I've also contested from China with the B1Z station, and I would like to try contesting maybe from Europe sometime. I've not had the opportunity to operate in Europe, but I'm hoping I will someday.
Now, do you have a Go box or a portable radio that you carry with you to do these contests abroad?
I do. For Chile, I usually bring a small radio, an ICOM 7000, with an LDG antenna tuner, a Samlex power supply. It all fits in a small Pelican case that fits inside a suitcase, and it comes through as checked luggage. For the Turks and Caicos, I bring a bigger footprint. I have 2 large Pelican cases that I check as checked luggage on the airline. One carries the ICOM 7600 with the microham microkeyer interface, the key, the Bengali key that I bring, the coaxial cable, and the second case carries an ACOM 1010 amplifier that gives us about 600 watts of power. And then I have a third suitcase that I put other peripherals in, coaxial cable, emergency supplies, things like that. For many years, I was taking a vertical dipole built by Force 12, a Sigma 40XK, to Chile every time I went. Last year, in each trip, I put it in a golf bag, a hard shell golf bag, and would just check it as golf clubs. And, of course, the airlines allow you to check golf clubs, so I was never really questioned much. But at the airport last year, they said, "Do you have golf clubs in there?" And I said, "No, I have an antenna." And they said, "Oh, well, we'll have to charge you $250. And I said, "What? $250? That's quite outrageous." They said, "Well, that's the cost, and that's on the website." And I couldn't negotiate a lower cost, and my daughter was coming along, and she said, "Dad, you've done this for 10 years. This is cost amortization. Just pay it and take it." So I did. And I got to Chile, and I said to one of my close friends there, I said, "Do you mind if I leave this with you at your home?" I said, "Do you have room in your garage or at a second, your vacation home or something?" He said, "Sure. Why not?" And so I left it. And that way, because if I brought it back, Eric, it would have been another $250, and that would have been more than the cost of the antenna itself. And I thought, well, I can't do that. That's just wasting money. So I left it. And this year when I went and operated, it was there. And now my friend who has it at his summer home, so to speak, right on the ocean, and there's a picture on the QRZ page of this vertical dipole up at his place in Tunken, wants to get his radio license. So I'm hoping that perhaps he'll get his license, and then the antenna can stay up year-round at his place, and he can use it, and I can operate when I come down. And I also have believe it or not, a 2-element stepper that I've bought to take to Chile for contesting, but I've never traveled with it. And I'm beginning to wonder if maybe ham radio hasn't become more of a disease than a hobby when you have spare antennas like that.
When you're checking the Pelican cases, you also pay extra now, right? Unless you have so many frequent flyer miles.
Yes, that's correct. In fact, I use frequent flyer miles typically to upgrade to business class on the trips to the Caribbean, so I don't have to pay for the luggage. But I do have to pay a fee in the Caribbean when I land for the value of the equipment we're importing. It's like an 8% tax on the value of the equipment. So I create a manifest, and then I pay a tariff and for the temporary importation of my own equipment into the islands. Because you don't want to leave equipment in the Caribbean. It will rust, and the salt water will corrode it. And secondly, I would have to pay a tariff to bring it and leave it, and I don't want to do that. So almost everything in my station has 2 purposes. I make myself with any radio I buy now, it has to have 2 purposes. It has to be able to be mated with my main radio for SO2R or Multi-1, or it has to be flexible enough to take overseas or for contesting or for field day. And I just don't accumulate equipment for the fun of it. I'd really try to strategically think about how it will work, how it will fit. And that way, the dollars that I'm putting into it are able to be used for more than one purpose that I enjoy doing. And Glenn Johnson, W0GJ, taught me how to take equipment overseas, and that one could. And, I've been doing that, and I've just been having a lot of fun. Someday maybe I'll upgrade to one of the radios to a Flex, and then I can have an even smaller footprint and just fits in my briefcase.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
You mentioned earlier, and you've actually mentioned twice, that you've operated from Beijing, China. Can you share an impression about amateur radio in China that you came away with?
Oh, sure. You know, it was the first time I'd operated in China. It was the second time I'd visited the country. And between 2002 and 2007, the number of ring roads around Beijing had increased. And China is an amazing place that's growing with a very intellectually curious population who want to understand the world, be connected with the world. And I want to say a big thank you to the radio club in Beijing and to Fan Bin and all of his friends who hosted me. They treated me like a member of the club, and I felt very welcome, and they invited me to come back and gave me an honorary membership in the club. And so I got directions to the station because it's located about 40 miles outside the city, and I hired a car and driver to take me there. We had the cell phone number for Fan Bin, and we couldn't find the station initially, so we called him on the cell phone. And then he said, look for the mountain with the antennas. And sure enough, it was like seeing a huge shortwave radio station. They had multiple towers. I mean, they had a single monopole for 160 meters that was a tower. And they had very modern antennas, mainly Force 12 antennas, mono banders for each band. They had old Henry amplifiers, and they had relatively modern Japanese radios, Kenwood, Yaesu, ICOM, and a JRC radio. And they're a very efficient contest group. They, in fact, I think they bring some of the hams bring their own equipment to provide it, but it was all computer run, just like a multi station in America. And they are top-notch operators. And the group that I worked with in May of 2007, two of the members had just returned from BS7H, from Scarborough Reef, and they told me about that. And I said, I didn't get you in the log because my amplifier was broken for the entire time that you were there. And they said, well, we're going to go back, and the next time we go back, we guarantee that we'll hear K0MD in the pileup. So I'm not changing my call until I can work them, Eric. But I hope they can go back soon. And anyway, it's a very sophisticated hobby. And I have to say, since then, it seems that the hobby has really grown in China. Year before last at Dayton, I hosted Fan Bin and two other operators, one from Hangzhou and one from another city in China, and they just have top-notch stations. So the hobby is exploding there, and I think it's a sign just of the economic of affluence of China, that as a country gets more affluent, more people become hobbyists, and that's truly happening in China. There's a lot of ham activity in China that we may not hear because they're running low power, but they have a large number of operators, and I think they are going to be competitive on the world stage in contesting and in DXing.
Now, you say they operate low power. Are they not allowed in their individual stations to operate high power?
I think the reason for that is simply economic. Many of them buy the radio, and then they have to wait to save the money to buy the amplifier, just like most amateurs in America are low power. The Europeans, the Middle Eastern operators, the Asian operators who hear K0MD and K9CT and W0GJ, K3LR. For every one of us who can run high power, there are 100 or 1,000 hams who don't have an amplifier. I think the same is true in China. It's just the same proportion of hams who own an amp versus who don't.
Do you find the language in China of amateur radio operators, is there English there?
Yes, they spoke great English with me. And the organization or the university who had invited me to speak, and in fact, in 2007, I was invited to a government forum along with a number of Mayo Clinic physicians. So I was treated very nicely by the PRC. They provided a medical student to go with me and translate in case I had trouble, but they spoke English. And the medical student, this was his first introduction to amateur radio. And it was like watching a youngster discover something new to see him watch what happened.
You live in Rochester, Minnesota, and when I think of Minnesota, I think of frozen winters and ice fishing. Do you ice fish?
I don't. I do low-band DXing instead.
Do you fly south to warmer climates in the winter?
No, we usually don't. I mean, my wife and I both grew up in the South in Kentucky, These winters are certainly more harsh than the winters we had in Kentucky. Kentucky was not a temperate place in the 70s when we grew up. It had lots of snow and cold weather. The Minnesota does have long winters. It does get very cold in January and February. I don't mind the brutality of the cold so much. What I find challenging is the duration of winter, which can start in October, typically November, and runs through April. But I have to say the silver lining for the long winter is that we have very quiet bands. We have very good propagation, especially on 160, 80, and 40. And the ham community in Minnesota is the best ham community I've ever met in my life. I say there are several reasons that I stay in Minnesota professionally. One is the Mayo Clinic, and two is the ham radio community. I've never met a better group of supporting HF hams than the Minnesota Wireless Association and the Twin City DX Association. We really help each other, and it's not uncommon for several people to come to someone's home if you're putting up an antenna to help you with the project and spend an entire day or two.
Now, you list a whole bunch of amateur radio associations that you belong to. Do you try to attend all of their meetings?
I try to attend the annual meeting of the MWA. I try to attend one or two meetings a year of the TCDXA. It's 2 hours from my home, so it's largely impractical to leave work and to get to the meeting. It's just physically impossible unless I'm off work on a Monday when the meeting occurs. I do attend the meetings of the Rochester DX and Contest Club. It's a group that I started. And in terms of the other organizations, I largely am just a financial supporter, and I like the ARRL and other groups like that.
Do you find the Internet has made it possible to become an active member in many of the clubs? Do you find that many of these DX organizations now have active online forums and stuff so you can be a part of a club without actually living there?
Yes, and that's true of the Minnesota Wireless Association. We have a number of members who geographically live outside of Minnesota, contribute regularly to the reflector and the intelligence base that we, the archives that we have of ideas and of talks and things. And I find the Internet has really broadened substantially the opportunity to learn, whether it's great websites like the PVRC webinars, your webcast, which I listen to nearly every program and learn something from all of your guests, to other shows that are on, and also clubs that have archives where you can find slideshows and you can just learn. Like Contest University, I attend that in Dayton every year, but I also watch the presentations again on YouTube or look at the slide sets to continue to learn. If you're a curious person and want to learn, there's never been a better time in ham radio to supplement your knowledge than what's available on the Internet.
You alluded earlier to the fact that you appear to be highly organized and you make time for amateur radio just about every day. Do you think that's the secret of being a successful amateur radio operator, is to manage your time and make dedicated slots for it?
Yes, I do. I've been intrigued by the answers your guests give about how do they make time for the hobby in past shows. And when I thought about that question, even before you asked me to be a guest on your show, I have to say that two things come to mind. The first is that I don't budget huge amounts of time for the hobby, but if I can get on for half an hour to an hour most days of the week, it's good for me. I seem happier. I once asked a world-famous cardiac surgeon at the Mayo Clinic why he played golf. And he said, well, I reckon it's cheaper and more effective than psychotherapy. And I have to say that the same is true for me with ham radio. Now, I don't belittle psychotherapy at all. If it's the therapy that's needed for a particular disease, good. But for me, ham radio is my stress element. It's better than drinking a 2-carbon fragment or watching a TV show or reading a book in terms of relaxing. I think small amounts of time and strategically place small amounts of time will help you to enjoy the hobby. And the second thing that I think is equally important is that every December I get out some paper and I set some radio goals for the next year. What do I want to accomplish in ham radio? And then I figure out how do I accomplish those goals. So if my goals are to work one contest or two contests overseas, I figure out if I can afford to go to the Caribbean to contest that year and budget the time and the funds with the family to go. And then I also look at my work schedule and I say, well, I should take a radio with me for this so that I can operate overseas at this time. Because I have goals, for example, to work DXCC from Chile, and I have 70-plus countries confirmed. So I need to take the radio back down again and continue to work on my DXCC. So I think setting goals and using small increments of time. Most of us never have huge blocks of time because anything else we have to do, whether it's work, whether it's chores at home, will expand to fill the time we have. So I try to budget a half an hour to an hour. And sometimes I'll just continue on if there's a huge pileup at 10:30 at night and I'm working stations in Asia and Europe. I'll just stay on until the pileup falls off. And if it's 11:15, it's 11:15. And I may go a little bit longer than an hour to get on.
I hear this with all of these interviews. The people who are the most successful in amateur radio, I guess I don't mean successful in the sense of financial success, but the people that move the marker the farthest in amateur radio, they're not spending hours a day doing it. They're spending just a dedicated amount of time, even a small amount of time every day to make that one contact. They're moving their stone every single day rather than in spurts every couple months.
I have learned that. That's something I learned at Contest University, and I've practiced it over and over. And in terms of my operating skills, I wanted to increase my CW speed so that I'd be comfortable at 35 to 40 words a minute in a contest. And I talked to a couple of hams who are well-recognized contesters, and I said, what do you do? And they told me, and so I just started doing that, like working smaller contests, a 2-hour sprint or a 4-hour QSO party, or just getting on for 2 hours for the All-Asian DX contest and running at a faster speed. And soon, my CW speed was up so that I could run 35 to 40 words a minute. And the reason I wanted to learn that skill was because that's one way to work the pileups down quicker when you're overseas. Because lots of hams want to work you when you're overseas, and they don't like to wait long. So the key is to work the fast operators first, and then work the slower operators next, because they'll hang around. The faster people leave.
So, Scott, you've had a chance to listen to the Lori Margolis K3UML interview, and you mentioned that you also had a King Hussein story. Could you tell that story?
Hussein came here in 1998 as a patient. So this is all public information. And I was not one of his physicians, but one of my colleagues who was my boss was his doctor. So I gave him several episodes of CQ and QST, and I said, please give these to King Hussein. We share a common hobby interest, and he'll know what to do with them. And tell him that I'll be glad to bring a radio station to the hospital and set it up if he wants one. And 3 days later, I get a page from my chairman, and he says, His Majesty appreciated the magazines, and he wanted me to express his great appreciation for your willingness to bring a radio to the hospital, but he prefers to come to your home to operate. And I said, sure. When can he come? Well, he's not well enough to come now. So that evening I go home and I say to my wife, hon, we're going to be having a guest. He's going to come over to operate, see my ham radio station, and we'll have dinner, but we'll have to have it catered because, this is going to require security detail. And she said, who have you invited? I said, King Hussein. And she said, you must be kidding me. We can't do this. We have young kids. This will be too much. I said, no, we'll get it catered, And I said, I think I should probably get my tower put up. I didn't have a tower up at the time. I had ordered one, but I hadn't got it put up. And she said, yeah, I think you should if he's coming. So I got a Yagi and a tower up pretty quickly. And then unfortunately, he never came. His health never recovered. But that's my King Hussein story. If you think that's of interest to the listeners of the podcast, I'll share it with you. And if you think it's just interesting but not so much fun, then we don't have to. And so a couple of years, last year I was in Chile talking to VE7 Sugar Victor, who also has a Chilean call sign CE2AWW, Dale Green. And I told him this story, and he said, when I was working on Vancouver Island, he said, I had a phone call from the embassy that said that His Majesty King Hussein would like to come to my house to see my radio station. So I said, sure. So he said, on the appointed day at the appointed time, the Canadian Mounties came in their cars, followed by a limousine, and His Majesty King Hussein got out, came to the front door, knocked, and Dale answered, and he said, hi, I'm Hussein. And Dale said, wow, nice to meet you, Your Majesty. Come in, would you like some tea, something? And he said, no, I want to see the radios. So Dale took him to his shack, and he had a new line of transceivers that the king wanted to test out to see if he wanted to buy it. And 2 hours later, there came a knock on the door from the king's assistant, who said, please tell His Majesty that we have appointments. He must stop. So Dale knocked on the door and said, Hussein, I'm very sorry, but your assistant has said that it's time to go back to town. You have meetings. And he said, tell him I'm the king and I'm going to continue operating. I'll go back when I'm ready.
Well, that's a great story.
Isn't that a great story?
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. As a cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic, what advice would you give to your ham brothers and sisters so that they can live long lives and do amateur radio?
I'm glad you asked that. I wrote an article for the National Contest Journal a few years ago, I think entitled How to Not Have a Heart Attack While Contesting. The advice is really what you know already from talking with your healthcare providers. It's to exercise regularly, eat a healthy diet. It's to keep excess weight off. It's to not do things that harm you like smoke or drink excessively. It's also to not let stress and anger overwhelm you. Find outlets to minimize that, alleviate that, burn that off, whether it's intense exercise with running or intense CW operating on the bands or something like that. And then I think it's also finding meaning in what you do. Those are the important things. I think what would ultimately be nice would be to have some type of situation where you could operate your radio and you could also pedal a bike or stand on a treadmill and walk. We have standing desks at Mayo that some physicians use, and they're walking on a treadmill while they're reading an echocardiogram or they're typing into the electronic health record. I think the ham community should embrace that as well, because most of us have sedentary jobs. Very few people today in the world work with manual labor, and I think we need to figure out how to increase the physical activity, and that seems to be the secret for longevity. It's being thinner or maintaining a healthy weight. It's eating not so many calories, and it's really staying physically quite active. I suspect that the very things that you're doing in Israel, Eric.
Well, I have two dogs that for some reason they're up at 5:30 every morning, whether I like it or not, 7 days a week. I recommend dogs for keeping you on the track.
Absolutely, and studies show that pets do help you to live longer because you're happy and you're socially more connected. So several reasons to recommend dogs. I have a golden retriever myself who likes to do things.
Yeah, the bigger the dog, the more they need to walk. A Pekingese is not going to be good for your exercise routine. A middle-sized dog is a great exercise dog.
Absolutely.
What excites you the most about amateur radio right now?
I think it's getting to do contesting, to achieve more and more goals, to see if I can improve my operating techniques, to also continue to work DX stations. I have close to 320 DX entities worked. I'd like to make the honor roll. And it's to also really the people I've gotten to know, the DXers that you've had on your show, and the DXers who do all of the top 10 DXpeditions, as well as those who speak at Contest University. It's the worldwide ham community is a collection of nice people. When I was a young teenager, and I remember someone asked my mother if she were worried about me being on ham radio, and she said, no. Look, there's CB radio where you don't know who your kids are going to talk to, but with ham radio, I know that he's going to run into nice people. And I have to say, with rare exception, I've met a ton of nice people in ham radio. So those are the things I like. What I like intellectually about it is the challenge to more efficiently design my stations, my antennas, to grow the station incrementally and to make it better. And it gives me some intellectual challenges in a new field. And I like the challenge of the learning and the challenge of seeing what's happening. So that's what really excites me. I guess if there's anything else, it's receivers. I love reading and learning about receivers. I love new receiver technology. And I'm really excited with the paradigm shift in the hobby to software-defined radios. I think this will be as pivotal to ham radio as going from AM to sideband was for DXing with voice. And I think 20 years from now, we'll look back and just wonder how we ever did it with superheads.
So do you have software-defined radios now?
I don't. In fact, I followed the advice. I put most of my money into antennas, and I think we're in a paradigm shift, and I'm going to wait just a little longer to get an SDR. If money were no issue, I would certainly go out and buy a Flex today and play with one. But I have a nice collection of radios. They're in excellent shape. I just can't justify changing out equipment at this moment. But I do think I'll join the SDR group in the short-term future, just not today.
So you're not using an SDR dongle or something like that?
No, I'm not. In fact, I've had a Flex in the shack twice on loan, and I love operating with it. It's got great audio sound. I love the filtering. I love the screen and the pan adapter. But I'm really excited to see ICOM and Flex and other OEMs compete, because I think the SDRs are only going to get better as more people enter the market. And I think it's going to be pretty exciting 2 or 3 years from now. I bet that next year at Dayton, when we're there, we'll see some even more interesting SDR options. And I think the price will come down as well.
You're not ready yet to get rid of the knob?
No, I'm not. I think from a contesting standpoint, people who contest, even with SDRs like K9CT, W0GJ, and others, are all using the Maestros because they need knobs. You just, with contesting, your focus is on your logging entry window of the computer, but you need knobs to slightly turn the VFO to better tune in stations who are off-frequency calling you. So I don't think traditional SDRs that are mouse only are for contesting. They're certainly okay for DXing. And certainly okay for casual operating, but for contesting, I think the knobs are about as ergonomically as efficient design as we've seen, and probably the future SDRs will incorporate that. I mean, when Flex moved the paradigm to have a knob-based graphical user interface, it said something, because they really had not been anything about knobs until they saw that graphical user interface, and so they've now essentially accommodated the contesting and DX community. And I think all the other manufacturers, well, I know that there's a Russian manufacturer of SDRs that looks fabulous that's being sold now through Martin Lynch & Sons in the UK, and then a couple of stores in the US. ICOM has a 7300 and a 7610 coming out. I'm anxious to see what the ultimate ICOM SDR will be like, the replacement for the 7851. Well, when we hit that paradigm, then I think it may be time for me to consider an SDR.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams?
You know, it's a wonderful hobby, and it is a hobby. And I would say a couple of things. One, join the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL, so you can get a QST subscription. And subscribe to CQ Magazine if you're in the United States. If you're in Great Britain, join the RSGB or the CDXC, the Children DX Club, or one of those groups that put out wonderful magazines. And just read for a little while to see what's happening in the hobby. Secondly, I would suggest that you buy a new copy of the ARRL Operating Manual. It's a quick way to learn about all of the modes that are available and what the state-of-the-art operating techniques are. It's not an expensive book, and it's an easy read to sort of casually flip through. And then I would sit down and think about what you really want to do in ham radio. Is it your interest to do public service and to do maybe weather spotting, which is quite, popular where I live? We have one of the top weather spotting clubs in the country, I think, and parades and public service events. Or is your interest more like mine, to work overseas stations, DX, or do contesting? And then once you sort of figure out what you want to do in the hobby, write down some goals, and then strategically figure out how you can most efficiently achieve those goals. And finally, I would say join a club or an interest group that does what you want to do. You can join your local radio club, but if it's not aligned with what you want to do, you'll get frustrated and they'll be frustrated. So I think you're better off joining a club, even if it's not in your community, that has goals aligned with your goals. And if you're interested in contesting or DXing, every state or region has a premier contesting club. In Minnesota, the Dakotas, and Iowa, it's the Minnesota Wireless Association for contesting. The rest of the Midwest, it's the Society for Midwest Contesting. In other parts of the United States, it's other groups. So there's the PVRC or the Yankee Clipper Club, the Northern California Contest Club, Southern California Contest Club, others. But I would say join a club and get on a listserv and get on email and just start chatting with other ham operators who share your interests. And their enthusiasm will stimulate you. Your enthusiasm will reinvigorate them. And suddenly the two of you will stimulate each other, and it will be 10 to the third power instead of 10 plus 10. And you'll enjoy the hobby a lot more. And I think that's the efficient way. You don't have to spend a ton of money. You don't have to build an antenna system like I do to contest or DX. You can have a single Yagi antenna, or like my neighbor K4IU, just have wires and trees and strategically place them for different bands. But you don't need to buy an expensive radio. You can make DXCC or win contests with old equipment. There are bargains to be had in the hobby. It's not a high-end hobby necessarily, but you have to set goals and figure out what you want before you start.
Well, it can be a high-end hobby on the one hand. On the other hand, as you'll hear in previous QSO Today episodes, some people build a rig with a few transistors.
Oh, they do, and I'm very impressed at the people, including you, who have the skills to build the QRP radios or the 100-watt radios. I don't quite have those technical skills. I really didn't get any Elmering in terms of building or soldering, so that's my knowledge deficiency in the hobby. I can help you design an antenna system on any given budget for your station, but I really can't help you build a transceiver. But there are plenty of hams who can. And as you say, you can spend as much or as little as you want in the hobby. It's like an automobile. You can buy a $2,000 automobile, or you can go into six figures in this hobby.
Yeah, and the diversity of hams with different skill sets is really quite amazing. The internet has kind of brought all that together. So that's what is, I think, the most exciting thing to me now about amateur radio is just being able to Google ham radio information.
I agree, and to have the sources, including the shows like yours, Eric, where the guests you have on have tremendous knowledge and success. And again, I thank you for a show like this because I've learned a lot from the guests that you've had on, and look forward to future shows because you do have a very nice audience and a very interesting audience. And I've learned things about the hobby that I didn't know. So you're contributing greatly to that knowledge base with your work.
Well, thank you very much. I always tell people I've learned more in the last 2 years than I have in the last 45 years about ham radio. As I said, and you've agreed, that the internet has really created this opportunity for all of us to share. We love sharing, right?
We do, and I hope someday that some of the great conferences we have, like Contest University, the W9DXCC, the Boxborough, Massachusetts forums, will be able to be live streamed so that people who can't travel for whatever reason, or people who are busy, can watch some of the great presentations that are going on. The dissemination of knowledge is very important in making us all better operators and making us better prepared for the emergency communications that we ultimately will be called upon to do, whether it's a small issue, a weather disaster, or something bigger. So I hope that the internet will continue to be a more pivotal role in ham radio. I have to say, in the mid-2000s, W0SA came to my home. Peter Cross, he's a big DXer and also operates in the Barbados every winter. And he looked at my station and he said, the first thing you should do is buy a computer to do computer logging. And I said, a computer with ham radio? You must be crazy, Peter. I would never do computer logging. I like the old paper logs from the ARRL. Well, like many things, Peter was right, and I wouldn't go back now to that, and I wouldn't trade off what the computer does, whether it's the reverse beacon network or the spotting clusters, the dissemination of knowledge, or the ability to have even conversations like ours through Skype that we couldn't have unless we were physically together. And I hope that you'll do a special show whenever you make the Dayton Ham Convention from Dayton, Eric, and I'm very interested to see your impressions with the hobby when you see the huge vendor displays at Dayton.
Well, I'm anxious to go to Dayton, and hopefully I'll even have the ability to collect some ham radio stories while I'm there. You just made a point about computer logging, and I think you said someplace either it was on your blog or maybe on the QRZ page that you've saved $100,000 by using computer logging rather than doing QSLs the old-fashioned way.
That's right. On the QRZ webpage, I talk about how many QSOs and contacts that I have. And currently, I think I've on the webpage say that I've uploaded over 69,800 QSOs and have over 39,900 QSL confirmations. And if you count the printing cost and the postage cost and the cost of envelopes, just conservatively between domestic and DX at $2 to $3 per QSO, and I use $3 for this calculation, I've said that Logbook of the World has saved me that much money. Now, would I have spent that kind of money QSLing? No one would. But just to have that degree of efficiency and to have that degree of flexibility to collect these, and that's why I became a Maxim Society, member of the ARRL, and made a large donation to the Second Century Fund was because of really what the league and its organization has done to promote the hobby and to help me achieve some contest or DX goals that I wanted without having to spend that type of money. And I use that as an example, and I sent it to Dave Sumner when he was CEO, and he said, well, Scott, he said, you wouldn't have spent that kind of money, but he said, you're right, but no one would spend that kind of money, but thank you for reminding us how much the Logbook of the World has saved the entire ham community with QSLing. So yeah, I think computer logging is amazing, and Eric, I wouldn't have any of the awards that I have today if it weren't for Logbook of the World, because I just don't have time to organize all of my QSLs into boxes and to sort them and to get the forms filled out. But with Logbook of the World, even I can do it. And I would say for any of the listeners today who haven't signed up on Logbook of the World, do, because it's easy and it really will help you to achieve the awards and the wallpaper that you've wanted your entire ham career.
Now, you say try Logbook of the World, but you say I do not EQSL. What is EQSL?
It's another way to do EQSLing. Someone has started it. It's a website. The reason I don't do it is that none of the contacts count for awards with the ARRL or CQ or any of the European clubs that issue awards, and it requires you to upload a log periodically, and I just find it too much of a hassle. I upload the Logbook of the World nearly every day, and CQ and ARRL will use Logbook of the World for awards. So that's why I do that. I don't do EQSLing because there really are no traditional awards that you can win. EQSL will offer awards that you pay for, but I'm not interested in their awards.
Okay, so I'll put a link to EQSL as well in the show notes page, as well as Logbook of the World, just so that people can see the differences. Anyway, Scott, I want to thank you very much for joining me on QSO today. You're a great guest. You're very articulate, and you told your story really well. So what more could a talk show host want, right?
Oh, you're very kind. Thank you, Eric. Listen, it's an honor to be one of your guests. You have a great show. I've really enjoyed listening so far, and I can't wait to hear some of your future guests on the show. You add a great service to ham radio, and among the many of us who enjoy your show, let me just say thank you for what you're doing to make the hobby more interesting. And someday I hope we can have a QSO on CW or sideband between 4Z1UG and K0MD.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, and 73, and the best to you.
73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Scott. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday and put in K0MD in the search box at the top of the page. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is still open until September 9th. You can get to the Expo website, if you haven't already done so, by clicking on the banner in this week's show notes page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor any of these episodes into written text, please push the button in the middle of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on a host of platforms including Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and the iTunes Store. A list of these services is on the right side of the show notes pages. Stitcher is still my favorite. My thanks to my friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who makes every QSO Today interview guest and this host sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.